Hello and welcome to Connections, a podcast series offering bits of information and inspiration about education and recreation on topics that may be of interest to parents and caregivers caring for children with vision and hearing challenges. I am your host, Dr. Jenny Stepanek, and today's episode features Dr. Sandra Newcomb, who will be talking to us about cortical visual impairment, or CVI. So welcome, Dr. Sandy, as many of the people you work with know you. Tell us a little bit about yourself as a person and as a professional.
I am by profession, I started as a special education teacher, and then halfway through that career, I got certified to be a specialist in vision, children with vision impairment. I've also worked at the University of Maryland, training teachers and running research projects. And I worked with the Connections Beyond Sight and Sound Maryland, DC Deaf Blind Project for a number of years. I am now semi-retired and only do private consultations. And I'm a mother of 3 adult children and 9 amazing grandchildren. Yes, I'm old.
That's wonderful. So you're here to talk to us about cortical visual impairment, CVI. In a nutshell, what is CVI?
CVI is a vision impairment where the issue is that the vision system has 2 parts. There's your eye that receives the picture, and your brain has to interpret what it is, the signal the eye sends to the brain. Cortical visual impairment is where the eyes are healthy, or maybe there's something slightly wrong with the eyes that can't explain the level of vision impairment. So it's maybe you need glasses, maybe your eyes, one eye crosses or something, but that doesn't explain why you don't respond to anything. So CVI is actually a vision impairment about the brain and how the brain is able or not able to interpret vision information. It is the leading cause of vision impairment in developed worlds now.
Wow.
Yes.
Who is impacted by CVI? Who gets CVI?
It is mostly children who have had some sort of brain injury, lack of oxygen at birth, seizures right after birth, things like that. It is kids who have also got genetic conditions or conditions that affect the brain and how the brain is formed. And it is kids, we're finding more kids now that they're doing such a good job of identifying genetics, the genome sequencing. We're finding a lot of the genetic syndromes that affect the child neurologically cause CVI issues, because it's a neurological brain-based vision impairment.
And you said it's the leading cause of vision in this country and in developed countries.
Yes.
So it sounds like this is a really important topic to be talking about in this podcast today. Why does it matter for a child to understand CVI, for parents and providers to understand CVI?
It's really important for everybody in the child's life, including the child, to understand their vision. The vision characteristics, which I can explain later, are different when you have CVI versus having an ocular condition like something's wrong with your retina. And so vision can improve because it's about the brain, and the brain can learn and kind of rewire and figure out some things about the visual world. So it's critical, because if we know and understand, then we can give children the right interventions that will help their vision improve and help them interpret the visual world, which is what they're having trouble with.
So who makes the CVI diagnosis? Who's the one that looks at the child and says, this is what is happening with their vision?
Typically, it is a pediatric ophthalmologist. And in all reality, some pediatric ophthalmologists know CVI better than others. So wherever, whoever's listening to this, wherever you live, make sure you know who your ophthalmologists are that understand CVI. But it's typically an ophthalmologist. Occasionally I've seen a neurologist diagnose CVI, but typically it is an ophthalmologist.
And how does that person, that professional, make the diagnosis? What's involved in understanding that this child has CVI?
They look at the medical history to see if there is some brain insult or injury, or is there a syndrome, or is there, whatever. But my best ophthalmologists look at the child and say, okay, there's a vision impairment. They examine the eye. The eye is healthy, so that can't explain the vision impairment. And if it's not the eye, it has to be the brain. Therefore, you get the diagnosis of CVI.
So it's really looking and looking at the history, looking at the child, and if the eye can't explain it, then we look at the brain and the history.
It has to be the other part of the system, which
Yep.
is the eye. I mean, the brain.
The brain, yeah.
Yes.
So once a child is diagnosed, and family hears, my child has cortical visual impairment, my child has CVI, how do we begin understanding what that means to this child? How do we begin measuring CVI, assessing it, and dealing with it?
Well, I have a short PowerPoint to explain what CVI looks like and to explain what the vision characteristics of CVI are. So I will share my screen.
Okay.
Okay. Creatively, I entitled this cortical visual impairment.
Very good.
Very good. You'll see some people call it cerebral visual impairment or cortical/cerebral. I'm not even going to get into that whole debate today, but it's about the brain. So what I want to do is talk about the main people out there that have done a lot of work around CVI and talk about assessment so that we know what we're looking for. The first one I will mention is Dr. Gordon Dutton, who is an MD doctor in Scotland, and he has a website, which is on a later slide, CVI Scotland. And when he does an assessment, these are the things that these are the characteristics that he observes. And I'm not going to talk about each one of these, but because what I want to do now is show you the other big person in the field is Dr. Christine Roman, or Roman Lancy. And she created an assessment that looks at these particular characteristics of CVI. And both Dutton and Dr. Roman decided what to observe based on the early literature where ophthalmologists and neurologists began seeing children with CVI and saying, "Wait, this kid is really visually impaired, but the eyes are fine and we don't quite know what this is, but their vision's very different than our kids with an ocular visual impairment." So early on, people just documented different characteristics of children with CVI, and that's where Gordon Dutton's work came from, and also Dr. Christine Roman. This is what I want you to see, and I know it's a very small print on this slide, and as a vision teacher, I apologize, I hang my head in shame, but I wanted it all in one place to show you. On the green side, hold on a second, on the green side is Dr. Roman. She created an instrument called the CVI range. And I think Dutton calls his it's a CVI checklist or protocol. I don't remember what he calls. It's not his. But if you look, there is more that's similar than is not similar. So Dr. Roman talks a little more about color, and Dutton mention color specifically as a characteristic or the need for color. Dutton doesn't talk specifically and label it latency, but he does talk about giving the child time, and it takes longer in certain environments. They both talk about visual fields. They both talk about complexity. Christine divides complexity into complexity of the object, the array, sensory complexity, faces. He does the same thing, but he talks about visual interpretation, and he talks more about acuity. And then he talks about the visual environment and clutter, and this word simultaneagnosia, which means you can't see but one thing at the time and kind of not in the periphery. He talks about the visual environment and how much is going on. And with faces, there is a condition called prosopagnosia, which is the inability to interpret or recognize faces. And Christine talks about complexity of faces. They both talk about lighting. Christine talks about distance and the problems with looking at a distance. He addresses distance issues with visual acuity. She talks about reflexes. He doesn't mention those. Novelty, he talks about visual interpretation. How do you know what you're looking at? And the visually guided reach, he talks about reaching. Now, under color, he does talk about color and contrast sensitivity. So I guess that it is similar to Christine, and he does in a number of his categories talk about visual acuity, and Dr. Roman does not talk about visual acuity. So those are the, as you see, you know, they're not really two schools of thought. They're both looking at the same information about the child. They are both observing it, and they are both charting it in some way.
What do you see as the biggest difference in the approach to assessing CVI between Dr. Roman Lancy and Dr. Dutton?
Dr. Dutton feels a little more medical, which makes sense because he's a doctor. And he talks about some of the things that you see in kids with ocular issues, such as contrast sensitivity. Christine does not particularly talk about contrast sensitivity. She does talk about, you know, bright colors getting a child's attention. And he talks a lot more about vision acuity. And Dr. Roman does not talk about measuring visual acuity. But that's the biggest thing I see.
All right. When you are working with a child or assessing a child, and trying to understand their CVI, because CVI is it's a name, okay, but it impacts each child differently. And they come in different phases and different levels of how they're able to use their vision. How do you know, which of these approaches do you tend to use more, and do you have a preference, and if so, why?
The biggest difference, and this was actually Dutton, and this is the website, cviscotland.org. The biggest difference, and this ties into why I choose to use one approach over the other. Dutton, once he sees kids, puts them in classification 1, 2, or 3 groups. But if you look at his classifications are not based on vision, they are based on other disabilities, the child's ability to move, their cognitive functioning. So classification 1 are the kids with multiple disabilities. The classification 2, they can move, but they have normal cognitive function. And classification 3, they have CVI and no other challenges. Okay. So he classifies kids based on other disabilities. I have a problem with that personally, because I think once we start focusing on other disabilities and not just vision, then the kids that do have cognitive impairment are likely to be underestimated, and people will have lower expectations because your focus is on their cognitive skills. Dr. Roman created the CVI range. There's also in Dutton's classification system, you put a kid in one of the classifications and you've done all your observations and testing, but you don't have any score, any quantifiable way to you just make a judgment about where
they're categorized but not measured.
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't get that correct. Dr. Roman created the CVI range, which looks at the vision characteristics she identified from her research. And it measures the degree of impact of each one of those characteristics on a child's vision. And then you get a score of 0 to 10, with 0 representing no vision functioning and 10 would be typical vision functioning. She then divides kids into 3 phases based on severity of the CVI, severity of vision issues. And they have 3 distinct overarching goals. So in phase 1, those kids at the lower end of the score, all you want to do is build stable visual function. You want them to use their vision and to look. In phase 2, you are able to integrate vision with function. So I look at something, but now I can act on it. And then in phase 3, you're able to use your vision for learning. So there's visual learning and you see visual curiosity.
So if we looked at Dutton would put people or put children into lots of concurrent issues, minimal concurrent issues, no other concurrent issues.
Correct.
You would have people in all 3 categories in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3.
That's correct.
And phase 1, I imagine, would be, after an injury or shortly after birth or at the beginning of an intervention program. Is that correct?
Sometimes.
Okay. So
sometimes that's correct. And the reason that's sometimes kids have such severe brain injury from a classic one is hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which means pretty massive damage all over the brain. I have a little guy now that has a diagnosis of HIE, but he also does not have a stable neurological system. He continues to have seizures every day. And if you don't have a stable neurological system, he has made progress with his vision, but I would still consider him to be in phase 1, even though he's been in intervention for a while. So, normally that is the kid, they are the kids at the very beginning of intervention. And then, we are hoping they move on up in their ability to use their vision.
So you've talked a lot about, or you've mentioned a lot about characteristics, color, light, complexity, fields, distance. What are the characteristics of cortical visual impairment? What is it that you are referring to? How many characteristics are there? How are they looked at? How would a family begin to understand this whole condition?
Okay. And these characteristics are based on the work of, one more thing. Before, I don't want to leave out Perkins, because Perkins has a really big CVI center, and they've developed the Perkins CVI protocol. There's a website there. I have not actually seen the protocol, so I can't comment one way or another. From what I know, it's similar to both Christine and Dutton, and kind of takes both, and it's the same kind of where you interview families, you observe, you assess, but I don't know exactly what they do, but keep checking with them because they're a big CVI resource in this country. But I can't speak to their CVI protocol and whether I would or would not use it. But I use the work of, hold on. I use the work of Dr. Roman because I can quantify it. I can look at progress. I can look at specific characteristics, which give me specific interventions. But what I want to say now is that the dilemma with CVI, I'm going to show you several children. They all have the diagnosis of CVI. This little girl would be what we would consider phase 1, although she is acting on this ball. When I assessed her, she only looked at shiny red things, and that was it. Oh, back up.
That would be color and light, shiny and red.
Bravo, Catherine. And, you know, I'd have probably asked the family to be quieter, but they were so excited that she did anything. We also weren't sure she could hear that, but I just let it go. This is a young lady using a talker.
Okay, what doesn't feel good? Hands. Please rub my foot. My feet hurt. What hurts? My fingernail. Stomach. Your stomach? Yeah.
So this teenager was able to say that her stomach hurt using a talker. She has CVI. This little girl is learning some sight words.
Time to work. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, are you ready? What is that? Find the word. Yeah, nope, I want the word. Good job. Sit.
Yeah, so she's learning some sight
It's
words.
time.
And this little guy is verbal, but I want you to listen to his interpretation of some of these pictures.
Once upon a time, there were how many? 3 dogs. 3 dogs. Okay. Turn the page.
No,
Title page.
Title page.
Okay. Oh, let me get past all this. Whoops, sorry. Now, tell me, what is happening in this picture?
It is playing in the sand.
Playing in the sand. And what is happening here?
And up here is making a mess.
Making a mess. The straw is banging.
I think he said door.
The door is banging. Door is banging. Is somebody knocking on the door?
Please,
Who is knocking on the door?
Nanny and Pa.
Nanny and Pa, okay.
But you
And
can
then
see in that, like, he's verbal and he's able to look at pictures and but he called them dogs. He didn't recognize that they were pigs. He did recognize door. He thought the wolf back behind the tree was just making a mess. And in the first picture, they were playing in the sand because he saw the brown underneath them. All of these children have the diagnosis of CVI. So that's kind of the problem. You get this whole range of kids. Now, technically, Dutton probably would have put all 3 of those kids in category 1 because they all have some cognitive issues. I'm not sure the last kid does, but you know, it's hard to tell with vision and motor. But they would all, but motor impairment. So every one of these kids would have been in Dutton's category 1. And with Christine's CVI range, Seth is in phase 3. He's certainly using his vision for learning, but having some difficulty interpreting it. The girl with the red ball, where she's just, all we want her to do is look, is clearly in phase 2.
what?
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the characteristics based on the CVI range, Dr. Roman's framework. Color is the first characteristic, and color is usually preserved in children with CVI. They often have early on a color that will elicit attention better than other colors, like the little girl with the red ball. Red was her color. Oftentimes, they still need or depend on color in the environment more than a child with typical vision. So this is baby Elijah, who looked at his little yellow duckies, and they continue when they're working on visual motor to use that color yellow for Elijah. But also for my higher kids, not that I would have any of my kids do this kind of activity, but you can see how color highlighting actually would help you find those things faster in the picture on the right.
And you would use the color that is the preferred color for that child.
Yes. And sometimes by the time you're at that level, there's not necessarily a preferred color. You know, that there's not a preference. If you know what it was way back when, then you might go back and use it. But color in general helps you. We use color you saw Abigail's words were outlined in red to call her attention to kind of the shape of the word. And so we can use that color highlighting to help kids develop sight word vocabulary. This was a thing that I did with a kid, and we were talking about North Vietnam, South Vietnam. And color is on the map to help you see the difference in the two places. We all use color. I'd hate to have to use a metro map on the left, right? That would be crazy. And then we all use color. Everybody watching probably would know exactly where you were if all you saw were those color symbols, right? Yep. Colors used everywhere, all around us to help us. The next characteristic is movement. Movement attracts visual attention. Sometimes kids with CVI only look at things that are moving, like the little girl with the red ball. Shiny things look like they're moving because the light reflects off of them. So she didn't look at anything that wasn't shiny. But what happens as our kids, okay, I don't need moves, like Seth certainly doesn't need movement. He's looking at a book, it's not moving. However, some of our kids at that level in phase 3 cannot suppress the need to look at movement. So right now, if somebody walked in my room, I'm aware of them, but because I'm doing something else, I am not obligated to look because something moved. A lot of our kids cannot not look when something moves. And you can imagine the dilemma that causes in a classroom. Every time a peer walks by, they're looking. And so then they get the label of Dr. Stepanek.
They're causing problems. They're
They
inattentive.
are ADHD.
Yeah.
Okay. They have attention issues. So these are young guys with shiny things. But this little girl, and this is in a pretend play sequence, likes this toy because it's a grocery store and you can make the groceries move across the flat thing there. This was an activity set up in a classroom to encourage a kid to crawl over and pull to stand, but the movement and of course the light, but the movement of the fish caught his attention. This is an example of how anything moving in the environment can distract our kids. Yes.
And it's a distraction because the brain is looking for visual input and they get it by the movement.
We are all attracted to movement, you know, based on when we were cave people, and if something moved, it might be a bear in the woods. So we have to alert to movement for our safety. So that stays in our brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, we alert to movement, but we don't have to, right? And so our kids, a lot of our kids in phase 3, if something moves around them, they can't suppress that need to turn and look. So you can imagine the dilemma in a nice, you know, preschool classroom with things, you know, this is the little boy in red. I don't know that he has CVI. This was a picture off the, you know, Google Images, but that's what it looks like for our kids, right? They're just looking.
Mm-hmm. And look at all the color and
complexity. And yeah, that was a CVI nightmare in that room right there. Latency is the length of time between when you show something and when a child looks or orients towards it. So we set up this activity. It's a slinky on a light box, and we give Jack enough time, and then he finally turns and looks. This is another example of the way that you may see latency. So this is Elizabeth, the girl you saw on the talker saying her stomach hurt. And of course, we're doing pumpkins. And she would look, but then she'd look away. She'd look and she'd look away often during the activity. She does that a lot. And a lot of our kids have to look away and process what they're seeing and come back to it. And that's a kind of a form of latency. The thing is, latency varies. So it takes longer to look if you're tired or sick. It takes longer to look if you're stressed or anxious. It takes longer when things are very novel or very complex. It looks like inattention. Processing slows down, and oftentimes light gazing, where a child just looks off at the lights, is a sign of vision fatigue, but it's like I got to take a break, and that's a sign of it's a sign of latency in taking a break. Visual fields. Children often have field losses or field preferences. So this little guy looked better at things on his right, so we have the balloon on the right. But most of our kids, even when they respond nicely on both sides, almost all of them have a lower visual field issue. And you see lower visual fields are critical when you're approaching steps or curbs, you know, that kind of thing. So safety moving around can be a real issue.
Yeah, even toys on the floor.
Well, this is Jenna, and with that lower visual field cut, they've got nice shiny stuff on that brush for her to look at it, but it's in her lower visual field on that tray, right? So we have to think about the lower visual field even when our kids aren't walking. Complexity is like the thing. It's the thing. And this was just a snapshot of a classroom, part of a classroom. That's the sensory side, and there's another side of this classroom. But look at how complex that actually is. The sensory environment, and that can be sounds, it can be movements, it can be any sensory information. It can also be internal sensations. So if I am hungry, or like Elizabeth said, her stomach hurt, then, you know, that internal sensation can cause you not to be able to use your vision as well. A lot of activities in the community we'd like our kids to go to, it's very high sensory complexity. Working against gravity increases sensory complexity. So this kid's on a wedge, and they're trying to get her to hold her head up to look at this book that they've made, and she's very motivated by that book. But that is very, you know, if a kid has to try to hold their head up and look, sometimes that's a deal breaker.
You
Carly
kind
and
of
I
pick and choose what is the point of the activity. Is it about looking, or is it about holding your head up?
Exactly. A lot of times that's why we have a hard time working with PTs, because if they're really challenging the child, which they need to do in that physical therapy session, that's not the best time for the child to use the vision. However, with a physical therapist, I can say, this is their most motivating thing in the whole wide world, and maybe you can use that to get them to hold their head up. So we can work together, but, you know, doing two things at one time sometimes is too hard. Carly can't look and listen. So sounds can be a sensory complexity. We're singing a song and doing our hands, and she's just light gazing. This one was a hysterical story. So Abigail is the one you saw with the sight words. And we go into Harris Teeter. We have a grocery list. It has 3 items with 3 words and 3 pictures. And she's getting grapes and water and chips, I think. And we're standing by the grape aisle. And as you can see, because it's early in the day, there's not much else on the shelf. And I thought, yes, this is perfect. She'll be able to find the grapes. And she stopped in the aisle, and she's just dancing and having a good time. And what I realized is they're playing music. And she was listening to that music and bopping to the music. She was not about looking for grapes. That music was a really cool, you know, song.
Mhm.
And it's like, see, I didn't even attend to it and didn't even think about it. But that it took her a while with the grapes because they're playing music.
Mhm.
The array, how many things are out, can be complex, and these are very typical toy shelves. You can think about the same thing at the library for older kids. So a lot of my kids can find Elmo in the first picture on the top, maybe the second picture, but never the bottom picture. This is veggie straws. That was the other item she was getting. And we really had to put them right at her eye level and kind of point her, because I'm not sure she'd have really found the veggie straws with all those chips, but that's a very complex array.
Mhm.
This is a worksheet that my friend Donovan was actually given in class. Look at how many pieces of information are on that page. And Donovan's funny. He would send it to me and say, Dr. Newcomb, is this appropriate for me? I loved it. I
Good for
loved it.
him.
Good for him. That's exactly right.
And
Talk
your
about
answer to the previous page?
was Donovan, that is not appropriate. And they gave him
Exactly.
a crossword puzzle as almost busy work one time, and he sent it to me. Dr. Newcomb, is this appropriate? And it's like, no, do not spend your vision energy on trying to do this teeny tiny crossword puzzle. And again, that goes back to what's the point of the thing? Is it just busy work? Is it that you want to give kids a list of words and some answers and make sure they have the knowledge? Then let him do that. Not try to put in a broad, right? But books, they're making this timeline look so really cutesy. That would be impossible for most of our kids to follow. Objects themselves can be complex. Pictures are more complex than the real thing. So this is a picture of the koosh ball, and the actual koosh ball is a strategy they're using, but they're teaching him that pictures have meaning. Picture symbols, you see a couple of symbols there from Boardmaker, they're more complicated than photos.
Mhm.
But look at what a lot of our teenage kids, and kids that really want to be with their peers and do what their peers are doing, they can't handle these kinds of video games, and that's what everybody's doing. Most of my kids don't like movies. They can't follow along with what's going on, what the action is, or cartoon shows. Real things are easier than line drawings, black and white drawings, cartoons, and that's a very abstract. Donovan told me that's the hardest one to figure out. It's an elephant. And he's like in 10th grade doing grade level work. So the last issue around complexity is faces. Faces can be very complex. So here they've got Kyle looking in a mirror, but they've got something behind. The thing you have to watch out for with mirrors is everything behind you is reflected in the mirror. So they've got a black thing behind him, so it's only his face. This was a testing item created by a woman in South Carolina, but can you just look at the face and match it? And this is a story. I don't have a picture of this, but Gabby is one of my children who's about 10 years old, and she worked with a girl named Autumn, and Autumn came in one day and had her hair really curly and a little shorter and bright orange. And Gabby looked at her and said, "Who is that?" And Gabby worked with Autumn every single day. And that's when we realized, a lot of times people would walk in the room and Gabby would say, "Who is that?" And we'd all say, like good teachers that we are, "Oh, Gabby, you know who that is. That's so-and-so. You see them all the time, right?" I felt so bad for her because she honestly had no clue who Autumn was once Autumn's hair was changed.
Wow.
She was using other cues to figure out who people were. So we never, ever say to her now, "Oh, you know who that is." We just say, "Oh, that's so-and-so." And then usually we say it before she has to ask. "Oh, look, Dr. Stepanik just came in. Remember her? She's got the glasses and the short hair." You got a few other salient features like the wheel.
Yeah. I'm rolling in my wheelchair with a ventilator.
Exactly. But then if you were out of the wheelchair, you probably wouldn't. Okay. But the need for light, many kids with CVI compulsively gaze at lights. A lot of times kids respond better to images that are backlit, like on an iPad or computer. And a lot of times kids who aren't compulsive light gazers, you'll see them looking off at the lights like Carly was when they're overstimulated. So we can use light to support learning. This is a PEG activity on a light box. This is my Lydia, and she loved looking at the iPad, and she could get her little fingers and operate some of the apps. This is a kid who is compulsively, that day she was looking at overhead lights, and we said, okay, let's just put a spotlight on the work that she needs to do. Well, you see what she did with the spotlight. Right? Like, she is so driven by light. Yes. I tried to light at her shoulder, and then she just kept turning around looking at it. Well, okay. Light supports vision. And the interesting thing for kids with CVI is that backlit surfaces help with vision fatigue. They're less fatiguing for our kids. Distance, distance viewing is oftentimes kids only look at things close to them, but it's a function of complexity. So many of my kids know that, but absolutely could not find the elephants at a distance, because look at all the other things that are in the array. Even a hallway that's clear, you think, oh, that's clear. But when you really look at it, the lights are shining on the floor, and there are stripes, and there are lockers, and one of them's got something on it, and there's lights overhead and a red sign. And I mean, it's really complex.
Yep.
And of course, a regular classroom, if this child sitting on the floor is supposed to look at that book, look at what else is in the array that they have to not pay attention to. And I don't think I have a single kid with CVI that could do that task right here. Vision reflexes are not something we intervene, but it's kind of like you look at them as a measure of how vision in the brain is. One is a blink to touch between the eyebrows. That's present at birth. And blink to threat comes in about 6 to 9 months, but that if something approaches your face, you blink. So we check them. Novelty is another huge issue, because I look at familiar because I've learned it and it's in my brain and I know what it is. If something's, grandma buys me a new toy for Christmas, oh my gosh, I have no idea what this is and I have no interest in it. Novel environments can be extremely challenging, and novelty is really tied into incidental learning, because I see something new and I see what somebody's doing and I'm learning about that thing. But if I can't look at that novel, I'm really missing all the incidental learning going on around me. But the question is, how do I know what I'm seeing? Almost any 2-year-old could tell you every one of those were dogs, but look how different they look. So how do you know they are dogs? And our kids with CVI, we have to directly teach them what to look for to know it's a dog.
Wow.
What is typically true about dogs? Typically floppy ears, long snout. Of course, look at the pugs. That's not always true, but typically true. Novel environments. Think about Walmart. Incidental learning. This baby is learning that dogs drink water, and learning that it actually is a dog and that they eat and drink just like she eats and drinks. But a kid without vision who wasn't curious about what was going on around them, we'd have to directly teach them that.
Mhm.
And the last characteristic is visual motor. Children often have trouble using eyes and hands together. They often look away and reach. And some children cannot look at what they're holding.
Wow.
So this is the typical look away when she reached for that toy. This is a nice visually guided reach and movement. We're scraping the seeds out of the pumpkin. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for now.
Well, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I'd like to have you come back and do another podcast where we talk about some strategies for each of those different characteristics and what it would look like to use color as a support in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or the different challenges. But
Lovely. Well, lovely segue to the last 2 things I want to show you. I will share my screen again. This is Jenna that you saw with the lower visual field.
Mhm.
The object has been modified and shiny stuff's been put on it to encourage her to look at it. That's a modification. But this is also Jenna. We brought things up in the upper field. We used shiny because it got her attention, and we used her absolute favorite color, purple. So even within this activity, we have addressed visual fields, color, complexity. There's only a couple of things hanging there. Sensory, because we've put her in a fully supported position, and probably something else, but I don't know what. But we have addressed many things in just the way this activity is set up. So that's
So there's a lot of things that can be done to support children as they move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, and that's the hope.
the
Does
hope.
CVI ever resolve?
Never completely resolves. No, kids continue to have issues with complexity and novelty is what I've found the most.
And you've mentioned that some children also kind of get either stuck or keep going back to, they keep regressing with their
Yeah.
visual function
If
due to a
they-
medical condition.
If you have a neurodegenerative condition, your vision's likely to go backwards.
So, well, this is fascinating, and I wish we had a whole nother hour to go through how do those characteristics look as things begin resolving and you move into the next phases. But for today, we'll wrap it up by asking, so what is the most important thing? You find out, you suspect your child or a child that's in your classroom might have CVI, or you get that diagnosis of CVI, the child comes into the classroom or the doctor tells a parent. What is the most important thing that parents and providers should be thinking, doing, asking, saying?
What I think they have to keep in mind is that vision impairment is a disability of access. And if we don't understand that child's vision and make modifications in the environment, the activity, the whatever, they don't even have access to what we're trying to teach them. And then they'll get judged as being lower cognitively when they never had a chance to learn the material. So I think we really have to think about it as access to information so that kids can learn. Because if we don't do what we need to do in the home, in the community, whatever, they lack information, which affects learning.
Thank you. Thank you for all the information. Thank you for taking us for comparing, two of the leading theorists on this, and helping to clarify categories versus characteristics and phases. Is there anything that you want to share that I have not brought up in this podcast? And we'll talk more at another podcast about characteristics and strategies and supports. But is there anything else that you think matters for families or providers to know in this session?
The thing that I think is most exciting, and the reason I'm so excited about CVI, and the thing that I want parents to know, is that CVI is a vision impairment where you can, with the right intervention, make permanent positive changes in that child's vision. I have seen kids go from phase 1, which is the Elizabeth using the talker and able to use the 2D material and that complex array to tell people that her stomach hurt. I started with Elizabeth at phase 1, and now she is a competent communicator with people around her by being able to use her vision. She still doesn't use speech herself, but that to me is there's hope. The vision can get better, and that will help the child learn. That's what I.
And from where I'm sitting, I would say that also, regardless of what category they be in, regardless of what their cognitive functioning is or their other concurrent challenges, being to get information visually, use that information functionally, improves quality of life, improves happiness and enjoyment, and would motivate you to want to learn more or seek more.
That's
So,
right.
so this really, really matters. Where can people learn more about Dr. Roman's work, about Dr. Dutton's work, about Perkins? I know you put the websites up there before.
Those are the three places I would go. Dr. Roman has a website. Perkins has lots of information and other webinars and trainings you can attend. And CVI Scotland is just a wealth of information.
Okay, and they were all on the slides earlier, so if
All
you're
on the
watching this and you missed it, just scroll back and find those slides or ask us and we'll send them to you. Well, thank you, Dr. Sandy, Dr. Newcomb, for being on today,
Thank you.
for sharing everything. And I hope you have a good rest of the day and enjoy the 9 grandchildren.
I will try. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.